Why, hello everyone, and welcome back to another history lesson with me, Miss Warren. Uh, Today we officially start a new unit, so we've only got two left. We've got this one and the modern era. So today what we're going to be talking about is World War One. This is where we get into the most interesting parts of history to all of my students, like ever. So let's get after it. So today what we're going to look at is we're really going to look at the road to what's called the Great War. Now the Great War is called the Great War because no one ever imagined that there would be anything like it ever again. So the Great War often refers to World War One. So what are the causes of World War One? Well, you have MANIA. So MANIA stands for, it's an acronym that stands for militarization, alliance, system, nationalism, imperialism, and then of course, assassination. So militarism really focuses on, building up the military. So you have what's called conscription, and that's just a military draft. So between 1890 and 1914, militaries across Europe doubled in size. Most countries were aggressively preparing for war because they just wanted to. They needed to look tough just in case anybody came poking at them. So you had a lot of military commanders at that time who were also planning for invasions that weren't really flexible to negotiation or, diplomatic options. It was fight or nothing at all. And then you have the emergence of the alliance system. And this came about around 1907. And you see two major alliances kind of emerge. You have the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And then you have the Triple Entente, which is Great Britain, France, and Russia. These kind of look familiar because if you remember back to learning the world wars in, seventh grade, eighth grade, these should look kind of familiar because these would also be similar alliances to the start of World War II. Dun, dun, dun. All right. So then you have nationalism. And as discussed, nationalism and imperialism just, basically meant that each nation could govern itself, that your nation was superior to, other nations. And then imperialism was just that competition between colonies. Because at this point in the time, the world had already been carved up. So now they were fighting for land and resources. And then lastly, the assassination. That was just the spark that started World War II. So this is a map of those alliances that I was talking about. So what is this spark? Well, nations in the Balkans, so Eastern Europe, wanted to create their own state and gain freedom from the Ottoman Empire and the Austria-Hungary Empire. We discussed this with imperialism. So Serbia was absolutely determined to create a greater Slavic state. They were ethnic Serbs in other areas that were controlled by Austria-Hungary, Bosnia being one of them. But Austria-Hungary was like, yeah, no, we ain't doing that. So on June 28th, 1914, the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, also a pretty awesome band, and his wife Sofia visited Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia. And a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand had planned to kill him, or to kill them both. And they had a pretty smart, plan for all of this. Watch the video, it explains it perfectly. And so then you have Gabriello Principe, who, shot them both. Dun, dun, dun. So Austria, extremely upset over this, consulted with Germany, their kind of big sister, big brother in all of this. And after consulting with Germany, they gave Serbia an ultimatum and basically said, hey, Serbia, you have to pay for what happened. Even though this nationalist group, the Serbian nationalist group, had nothing to do with the Serbian government. And the Serbian government actually came out and said, yeah, no, we have nothing to do with them. We did not sanction this whatsoever. Didn't matter ultimately. Serbia rejected the demands, and Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Well, Russia was like, yeah, you can't pick on, you need to pick on somebody your own size. So if you don't back off, then we are going to help out the Russians, or we're going to help out the Serbians. Austria-Hungary didn't back off. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, so Russia was like, cool, we declare war on Austria-Hungary, which then in turn gets Germany involved. So it becomes this whole crazy just mess. So the ultimatum is laid out pretty much here, is that Austria-Hungary, wanted Serbians to suppress any publication that incited, hatred or contempt over the Austrian monarchy. They wanted, all the propaganda to stop immediately. They wanted to eliminate without delay any public instruction in Serbia that taught or had anything to do with propaganda against Austria. They wanted to remove them from military service and any administration. Yeah. And then the one that gets me the most is that they wanted to take judicial proceedings against any accessories to the plot of the death of Franz Ferdinand. Yeah, the Serbian government was like, okay, we agree to all of this except for one. And that's the one that's stating a foreign country can't participate in its judicial proceedings. That was seen as unconstitutional. So regardless, Austria-Hungary severed diplomacy and declared war via telegram. So Germany's reaction to all this was, well, because Germany was friends with Serbia, or friends with Austria-Hungary, they decided that they were going to declare a war on Russia and France. This gets really confusing. So they put the von Schieffelin plan into effect, which basically meant that they would keep Russians busy with a small army. They would use most of their army to attack France through Belgium, and once France was defeated, they would turn their attention back on Russia. When Germany actually moved through Belgium, they were technically neutral, which meant that Great Britain now got involved because Great Britain looked at Germany and said, if you go into Belgium, who was their ally, Great Britain's ally, Great Britain had no other choice but to declare war on Germany. So this created this whole crazy onslaught of just what I call stupidity. And we'll talk about it. So you have the Central Powers, which would become Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Italy would jump ship to the Allied powers because they were like, hey, I'm not getting involved in this. This is crazy. And like, no. So eventually Italy and the US would germ the Allied powers, which were Great Britain, France, and Russia. So in August 1914, World War I officially starts. Russia attacked with huge losses at the Battle of Tannenberg, and it helped because it distracted the Germans from France and Great Britain. France and Great Britain would counterattack at the Battle of Marne, and then the Germans and French would, dig trenches on what would be called the Western Front. This is the lands between France in Germany and Western Europe. So this is Germany here in France, and this would be the Western Front that they would fight on. And trench warfare was absolutely ridiculous. Trenches were elaborate ditches that were dug by the troops to stay out of enemy sight, and they were separated. Each side was separated by what's called no man's land. This was the land between each of the trenches, each of the two sides, that was filled with barbed wire, dead bodies, holes from bombs and grenades. Because of the trenches, soldiers would suffer this terrible disease called trench foot because of the terrible conditions. And sometimes you would hear commanders yell over the top, which meant that the men had to get out of the trenches and start running across no man's land to attack. This was not a very effective way of winning any war because it was constant back and forth. When you would gain, you would get comfortable, the other side would attack and you would lose. It was just not very effective. And this is trench foot. And trench foot came about because the men were constantly in water. And the only way to deter from trench foot is to change your socks and boots constantly. But they didn't have any dry area to be able to keep their feet dry. So this is essentially what happens to your limbs when you spend too much time in the water, like prolonged time in the water. So this is an example of no man's land. So, because Italy was originally a part of the Triple Alliance, they did establish a secret pact with France because they wanted some of the Austria-Hungary land. So they officially switched sides in 1915. And this is where we would start to see the War of Attrition. This War of Attrition meant that you were trying to wear down the other side with constant attacks and heavy losses until they couldn't recover and absolutely had to surrender. Everybody who got involved thought World War I would be 100% over with by Christmas of 1914. And here we are in 1915. And then in 1916, you have the Battle of Verdun, which is the best example of the War of Attrition. So it was a 10-month long just barrage of heavy artillery, and it only consisted of just a few miles. But because of this, 800,000 men would die from this fighting. In order to pull Germans away from Verdun, Great Britain launched attack at Somme, the Somme River. But the same results happened as Verdun. So for 3 years, 1914 to 1917, battle lines didn't move along the Western Front at all. So this is what the Battle of Verdun, some images looked like. So what about in the East? Well, in the East, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the Central Power side. So the Ottoman Empire controlled an area called the Dardanelles, which was the water route to Russia. So you have this Battle of Gallipoli in 1915. This was in order to gain control and get supplies to Russia, Australia, and New Zealand, mainly troops. They needed to get control and supplies to the troops. And it was a very bloody attack that went on for months. And it failed to take the Dardanelles. The Middle East would ultimately be controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Great Britain encouraged these nations to revolt. So they sent in the author T.E. Lawrence to help. And they called it Lawrence of Arabia. And they promised land to ethnic groups. Meanwhile, you also had the Armenian massacre that was happening. So there was tensions between Muslim Turks and Christian Armenians for decades in the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, Russians successfully attacked the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans blamed the Armenians for helping the Russians. So the Ottomans began to kill all of the Armenians. 600,000 of them died from violence, starvation, and forced marches and diseases over the course of a year. Nope. It's not even cool. Ottomans. And then you have the introduction of new technology into the war. So you had poison gas that was used, created by Germany, but it would backfire if the wind had changed. This would ultimately be outlawed by the Geneva Convention. Want to know what it is? Ask me. So they had to develop gas masks in order to counter the effects of the gas. You also had the introduction of machine guns that were developed before the war, but the tactics had to change in order to accommodate them. They weren't the lightest things to carry, and you needed a small team of men to control them. Then you had tanks and armored cars that were developed, but they were extremely unreliable. They were unsteady. They basically made you a sitting duck. They would be used more in World War II. And then you had the German creation, submarines or U-boats. And this was used mainly by Germany to attack supply ships that were heading between Great Britain and France from the United States. And this is where you would have the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 that would ultimately be one of the reasons the US entered World War I. And then you also have airplanes. This would be the first war that you would start the war riding in on horseback and then leaving in tanks and airplanes. Airplanes were developed to see and drop bombs on the enemy. The first versions of this were Zeppelins. Zeppelins were extremely unreliable because they were filled with highly explosive hydrogen gas. So they would, be back away from all of the artillery so that you could see what the other side was doing. But then they started to develop airplanes. At the end of the war, you started to see airplanes with machine guns on them, so it began to fight in the air. And then you also had flying aces, who were pilots who were shot down at least 5 planes in combat. And this is where the Red Baron would come into play. So on the home front, you had what's called total war. That means all parts of society was 100% involved. You had this propaganda machine that influenced people's opinions of the war. And then you also had women's rights that were happening at the same time in the United States. So men went to war, so women had to step in the workforce to make all of the material, all of the weapons. Nurses were also needed. So women's rights became major at this point in time. All right, y'all, I'll see you next time.